American here, and welcome to the podcast. I'm going to be your host today. Today, I'm speaking with Jamie Woodhouse, and Jamie runs a website and a blog called sentientism.info and promotes this idea of sentientism, which is essentially to base your beliefs in evidence, reason, and moral consideration for all sentient beings. And so this is kind of a broad and pluralistic mindset that includes, movements like veganism, anti-speciesism, suffering-focused ethics, that type of thing. And so we talked broadly about sentientism today, as well as sort of diving into some nitty-gritty thought experiments. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you.
Good.
All right, Jamie Woodhouse, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, John, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, my pleasure. So we came across each other on Twitter, sort of through various animal ethics, connections, and you run a site called Sentientism. And so I want to talk about sentientism and sort of these adjacent fields, but the traditional start of this podcast is always just a question about how coffee fits into your life if you drink it, how much you drink it, that will help me fill out my mental model of who you are.
Yeah, it's an important part of my life. I'm not quite on an intravenous drip, but it's heading that way. So yeah, it's sort of solid part of the routine. Double shot espressos with soy milk normally.
Okay, cool.
And on a good day, I'll hold to like 2 or 3 of those. On a bad day, it might stretch up to 4. So,
and do you have
it's
that
an important part of my life.
Do you make those drinks at home, or do you have them out?
Yeah, pretty much at home. So yeah, lucky to have a nice little espresso machine here, so that keeps me fed. And
beautiful. And you steam up the soy milk, or just toss it in?
I've got a it's not a steaming machine, but it sort of froths it, so it heats it up and spins it around, a little device. So when I can be bothered, I use that. Yeah. So it's not a sort of specialized barista kit, but it does the job. So
I'm also glad to hear that you're still on the soy milk kick. In Los Angeles here, it's always kind of like this battle of who has the newest milk, and I've been a long time fan of soy milk, but a lot of people just are sort of like, they'll be like, don't you know about all the things soy will do to you? And it's like, I don't know, I feel great. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly. Cool. The original and best. I think we'll keep coming back to it. So
oh yeah, absolutely.
We'll probably both be cancelled by the oat milk crowd now.
I hope not. Cool. So I'm curious, before we dive into sentientism, if this isn't your career, right? This is just like your blog. What do you do separately, and sort of what's your background?
Yeah, so by career, I'm a consultant. So I worked for a very big firm of management consultants for almost a quarter of a century. I was a partner there for a long while. And I still do some consulting and advisory work and coaching work freelance now. So I guess that's still sort of my trade. But I also run a variety of different projects that are more aligned with, I guess, the things I think are most important. So some of those are involvement in charities and NGOs and various aspects of campaigning or volunteering work. But this sentientism project is probably my favorite, probably the one has the deepest implications for all of the other things I do.
Awesome. Cool. So my understanding of sentientism is basically that it's just the foundation of, sort of acknowledging that we need to figure out what is true, via like science and rational thought, and also what to care about, and sort of like value theory. Is that a fair assessment? Or, it seems like it's a big, you described it as a sort of pluralistic, open-ended thing, but it seems to be all-encompassing of these adjacent fields. Is that how you think of it?
I think that's a fair summary. In a sentence, it's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So you could break that down into 2 parts, because it's trying to answer what I think are 2 of the most fundamental questions in philosophy. One is, what's real and what should we choose to believe in? And sentientism, very much like secular humanism or skepticism or, any other sort of naturalistic worldview, says, well, we should use evidence and reason to work that out. The other side of it and the second philosophical question it's trying to answer is, what should we care about morally? What matters? And there, the answer, the clue is in the name. It's any sentient being, and we define sentience as the capacity to have experiences. So you might call good experiences flourishing. You might call bad experiences suffering. So anything that's capable of experiencing suffering or flourishing, we should count that morally, at least grant some moral consideration and compassion. So it's answering those two questions, but it's doing it in a very basic, broad way. So it doesn't pretend to answer all of the other sort of more complicated philosophical questions. It doesn't tell you how to trade off different interests or priorities. But it just tries to set a very simple, pluralistic baseline, if you like, that hopefully lots of people could come to agree on as a starting point for how we address problems in the world. And then we can fight over all the details after that. But as long as we're all using evidence and reason to work out what to believe, and as long as there's no sentient being that we exclude or say we don't care, that's a pretty solid starting point from my perspective. So that's partly why I'm trying to raise awareness of it, popularize it, develop it a little bit.
Cool. So in terms of like researching sentience and where to draw the line, because I think there's people want to draw the line a lot closer to humans than I think we do. What's your sort of like process of epistemics here, and just like figuring out where you want to draw your line?
And so this is one of the other weird things about sentientism, is that it doesn't specify which types of beings or even which groups of species are sentient or not. It just says follow the science, that's it. So different sentientists will disagree about where that line is drawn, but over time, as the science develops and as our understanding of sentience develops, I think you'd expect them to converge and there to be some reasonable consensus about where that line is. That line is also always, I think, going to be, like lots of regulations, laws, or ethical things, we might practically have to draw a line, but it's more likely it's a bit fuzzy. So as with many useful concepts like life and health and well-being, you might find it difficult to put a really precise technical boundary around it. You might find that there's some fuzzy edges, and you might need to apply some prudence, or you might need to give certain things the benefit of the doubt. But I think it's fair to say, and I'm not a neuroscientist or a biological scientist, but from my understanding of where science is today, there's a pretty strong consensus that I guess humans are sentient. Hopefully many of us can agree with that, although there are some philosophers who might disagree. Some solipsists will say that they're the only thing that's conscious. So humans, very solid, but there's also a strong consensus around mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and quite a few of the invertebrates as well. But I think invertebrates in general is one space where there is uncertainty, there's more research required, and lower degrees of confidence. But there's some interesting research going on in those spaces at the moment. In practical terms, most sentientists, just out of prudence and to be, give things the benefit of the doubt, tend to include all animals in that category. But technically around the edges, if you look at something like a sea cucumber, it is classed as an animal, but it has no nervous system at all. So, I'm pretty confident, it's not capable of suffering. So in a way, one of the practical implications for most sentientists is they end up taking an ethical stance that is pretty consistent with many animal ethics advocates, and many of them practically choose to be vegan because the definition of sentient being overlaps enormously with animal, which is the word that's normally used in veganism. And the motivation for most ethical vegans is about reducing and avoiding suffering, which is a characteristic only of sentient beings. So there's a lot of consistency there. So there's a long answer, but hopefully gives you a sense of, I think, where the consensus is, and pretty much where I am too. So.
Your mentioning of a sea cucumber makes me think of somebody that I've heard identify as a bivalve vegan, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. Like, they're willing to eat crustaceans or whatever. But that's never been something that made sense to me. But I'm curious. So you identify, like, the vegan label is something that you run with?
Yeah,
personally.
Yeah, I do, and partly that's a prudence thing. Partly, I don't have a particular interest in eating mussels or anyway, so I don't feel that there's a drive to do that. But I also think the science is uncertain. So there are people who are confident enough around mussels, for example, or oysters, that they're not sentient, that they're comfortable farming them and eating them. I don't have that level of confidence because it feels to me as though the research is less conclusive, and consciousness and sentience are by definition very complex, rich, and difficult to understand areas, and the science is quite immature. So I tend to have grant quite a lot of benefit of the doubt for beings around it, maybe around the edges. But yeah, that's a motivation for bivalve vegans, is that they say, look, it's about reducing suffering. They've come to the conclusion, often with decent scientific backup, that mussels and oysters and so on are not physically capable of experiencing suffering or experiencing anything at all. So ethically, they're comfortable, consuming them.
Okay.
But yeah, I identify as vegan as well. So yeah, I even give mussels the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. Me as well. I've been a vegan for 15 years, but being in Los Angeles, it's kind of funny seeing, it's pretty widespread now, which is awesome, but it's like interesting to see it being rebranded as plant-based. And there's just this observation I have of Los Angeles vegans, that they seem to be kind of like the loudest and maybe the least calibrated.
Oh, really?
I'm curious how like London vegans, like what the scene is like over there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really easy place to be vegan, like many big international cities, and it's important to remind myself of that. It's it's not as easy in many other places, so it is really easy. It feels like veganism here is where vegetarianism was maybe 10 years ago. So options in restaurants when you're eating out, the supermarket aisles with different alternatives, the big corporations being very comfortable branding things as vegan and coming out with vegan products. And, it feels the acceptability of veganism now has really shifted forward in a way that, as I say, is parallel with maybe veganism a decade ago. So it's easy, and it's moving and it's developing. But we've got a really, really diverse range of people in the movement here, as I think you do in LA too. With different motivations. So people will come to the movement with motivations around health or environment or ethics. People will have different views on, the personal changes we're making versus the importance of driving institutional and systemic change. There are many views about whether veganism should focus on animal ethics itself, or whether it should become linked to many other different types of movements of social change. And there are massively diverse views about whether we try and use capitalism to shift to the end of animal farming through economic pressure, or whether making that level of change requires a completely different economic system. So there's a breathtaking diversity of different styles and opinions within the movement. And as ever with these sorts of movements, it sometimes feels like they spend more time fighting each other than they do recognizing how much they have in common and working on a common cause. But I guess that's part of the sort of healthy friction of any movement that's really trying to make a big social change happen.
Now, when you say health, that's something I sort of want to double click on, because both of us seem like we're healthy individuals. But there's this big contention against veganism, and like some of the very smartest people I know have criticized me for this, and like it's usually something about like there's the obvious like how do you get your protein thing, which is just tired and boring at this point. But like the more sophisticated sort of qualm that somebody might have is like about phospholipids, or about like amino acid profiles in protein. Do you have, or like a DHA or something like that, do you have any like nutritional concerns that you've like taken special care with being a vegan, or do you have any stance on this?
I don't. I mean, and to be honest, the dietary side of it is I'm not a specialist in it, and I don't. It's not a driver of my motivation at all. It's a side effect, and the only way it could become an implication is if it had a chance of really seriously impacting my health, and it doesn't. I've been very comfortable on it. So I've not needed to take any special steps. It's just been common sense stuff. I'm pretty comfortable with the sorts of things I eat. I do take the Vegan Society in the UK has their own supplement that just sort of covers the bases of things like selenium and iodine and the other things that there's a risk you might miss if you have a really poorly planned vegan diet. So yeah, it's super easy really. I just sort of take one of those things a day, eat a rich variety of things, and that's it. I've had no issues at all. And I think that the fundamental for me is that, any nutrient you need, you can get from, a sensible plant-based diet. And ultimately we can get those nutrients from the same places as farmed animals do, which is essentially plants. And if you need them, a supplement. So it's pretty straightforward for me. But I think the health space is interesting because it is a strong motivator for some people. And as long as that is based on decent science and robust evidence, then it's a factor we can think about how to bring people into the movement and to get them to make changes that will cause much less, suffering and death. So it's an important thing to bear in mind, but it's really important. And I guess this links to the sentientism idea that, to my mind, it always backfires if you overplay the story. So if your appropriate focus on trying to promote veganism leads you to make claims that are poorly substantiated or driven by warped research or turn out not to be supported by facts, that backfires enormously. So when we do make claims about the impacts of, I think the consensus seems to be there at worst neutral and largely positive, but as we do make claims about impacts on of a vegan diet on health, we've got to make sure that they're well-founded. And we've got to make sure that we also don't skip over issues where there are real issues. We've got to be really frank and clear and upfront about
it. So another question I have about how you personally eat as a vegan, a lot of people criticize veganism for sort of like creating these meat replacers and stuff. And I'm wondering if those play into your life, like Beyond Meat, and if you have any feeling about that sort of like, like textured vegetable protein base of fake meat versus this upcoming cultured meat movement.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I'm reasonably open-minded about it. It's interesting, but as I dropped animal products out of my diet, I have developed to a degree a sort of aversion to those things physically. It's not necessarily a visceral disgust, but there's an association, an unpleasant association there. But at the same time, I do I still physically enjoy some of the textures and some of the flavors of some of those products. I'm quite comfortable with a variety of different alternatives, and that's certainly true of the plant-based alternatives that we have today. I'm still fairly purist about the cultured or the cell-based approaches, because at the moment those technologies still do require the use of some elements of animal products in many cases, and those companies are working to erase that completely so that they will be 100% pure vegan even for the purists. But I'm pretty open-minded about those. When they get to that stage, I'll happily try them. And I guess the most important thing really is not my personal preference for them and what I eat, but it's that I think they're going to have a fundamental role in achieving the broader objective, which is ultimately ending animal farming. And while I'd love 8 billion people to the light suddenly go on and recognize the harm they're causing both to non-human animals and to human animals through animal farming, and just decide we're not going to do this anymore, I think in real terms that's going to take way too long. And actually what we're going to need to make that change happen, because we can talk as much as we like about the increasing acceptance of veganism and the availability of products and so on, but if you look at the charts and graphs of animals slaughtered per year, if that keeps going up, we haven't achieved our objective. And to achieve that objective, I think we need alternatives. And you need to get to a point where if there are products that are widely available, that are as cheap or cheaper, that are as tasty or tastier, that are as healthy or healthier, that have a radically lower environmental footprint, and also don't cause sickening harm, that's how we'll win at real scale. So that's why, for me, those products are deeply important, because without those sorts of alternatives that basically beat animal products on pretty much every criteria, it's going to be really hard to drive, proper full-scale change of the sort we want to see.
Yeah. So I, only tried the Beyond Meat burger maybe like a few months ago, and
what did you think?
I mean, I was like, a friend made it for me, and I was like, like, this isn't actually meat, right? Like, I haven't had meat in forever, so I was convinced that it could be meat. But what's interesting about that is, like, it's so convincing, and it seems that the push to get this cultured meat, in terms of the actual taste, it doesn't seem that different, but I'm wondering if people just identify with it being like an actual animal source to some extent. Like, and so this makes me think of this question that I asked on Twitter and didn't get any good responses on, but it's basically like, why, like, what is it about bacon that people enjoy beyond a certain ratio of protein to fat with some sort of Maillard caramelization reaction? Is it just knowing that you are somehow, it seems like an anti-speciesist sort of indulgence.
And it is in a way, because I guess the reason people have grown attached to those sorts of foods is, I guess, one, just a technical, chemical response of their minds to, those tastes and flavors and those sensations. And even when people have switched their views ethically, they might still get pleasure from those sensations. And if we can do that without harm, why not? But at the same time, I think a lot of the reason people have come to accept that is because, through deliberate ignorance, not thinking about the implications of your actions, which, I certainly did for most of my life. Right? I enjoyed eating animal products and almost deliberately avoided thinking about the topic. And because socially it just seems so normal and is accepted, and you're almost indoctrinated into it from early childhood, that when you do decide to give that up, some people do see it almost as odd that then you want to replicate something that was associated with something you see as deeply wrong. So, I don't have a strong view about that personally. I think you're right. It almost, if they get too realistic, I probably would personally feel an aversion to that. But that doesn't worry me too much. What I'm really worried about is, does it reduce harm? Does it reduce harm? And I think they're going to play a significant role in that.
Do you think that you'll have the Peter Singer burger when it comes out? Because Peter Singer has said that he'd happily donate the sort of like starting point flesh for
the starter set. Well, it's bizarre. I mean, you probably have the experience as well. But whenever you talk about animal ethics on Twitter, it's amazing the sorts of things you end up talking about. I've spoken to people recently who have actually bitten the bullet and said, farming human toddlers would be ethical. So, it's amazing how many conversations around cannibalism and wild animal suffering and various other topics you get into. But, I think I'd still feel squeamish about eating a Peter Singer burger, even if it didn't cause him any substantial suffering. Technically, ethically, maybe there's no downside, but I'd still feel odd. So.
Right. Well, so I wanted to talk a little bit about anti-speciesism. Magnus Vinding, he argues that we should advocate for anti-speciesism over veganism, and he's promoting suffering-based ethics, and a lot of this is based in the cognitive bias of scope neglect. And there's sort of like this nitty-gritty thought experiment that I've seen going around. I think it originated on Less Wrong, but it's basically this sort of utilitarian aggregation problem of like, what's worse, one person being tortured or a quintillion people having a speck of dust in their eye? Do you have any sort of perspective on this? Because it obviously sounds ridiculous to somebody who's not just going through the thought experiment, but I'm curious about your take on that.
Well, there's two reasons why sentientism is a deliberately really broad pluralistic platform. One is because it enables a lot of people to have a common basis of agreement and work together on something. The other one is because it enables me to cop out of really difficult questions like that, because sentientism itself is neutral on consequentialism versus deontology versus virtue ethics. You could arguably be any of those things and still be a sentientist as long as you draw your moral circle in the right way. And it's neutral on, population ethics. It's neutral on whether you aggregate harms in those different forms of utilitarianism as well. So sentientism itself cops out of a lot of that stuff, which is great for me because it's difficult, and I'm not a professional philosopher. But my personal view partly tends to, again, duck out of those issues, because while there are some fascinating philosophical questions, I think there are some more obvious, immediate ones that we already know the answers to, that we can work on addressing right now. So, in a way, I prefer to prioritize there. So unless those more esoteric philosophical questions have a campaigning impact in today's world, I find them a little less tractable. But generally, I also, and again, this is a personal view, so many different sentientists will disagree, when it comes to thinking about population ethics and the future and the aggregation problem, I tend to be skeptical about raw aggregations, because there isn't any entity that's feeling the aggregated suffering or flourishing. So I do tend to sort of be hesitant about just mathematical aggregations of experience. I tend to come back to considering the individuals. And when we're thinking about population ethics and future potential sentience, again, this is probably naive and I just need to read a lot more, but I tend to have a bias towards sentient beings that exist today. And that leads me to a stance of saying, if there's a future entity, a future being that may never come into existence, and then does never come into existence, no harm has been done. And it can't be harmed because it doesn't exist and it will never exist. Whereas if you take some action which may create a future sentient being, and you do create a future sentient being, then that harm, even though it's in the future, is morally salient now. We should be cognizant of that. So that might lead you to say, it can be ethically positive to create a new sentient life, but there's no obligation to do that, because if you don't, there is no entity that you've harmed or deprived of life. Whereas if you, does that make sense? So you could probably sense my sort of amateur philosophy coming out, but that's where my sort of thinking is roughly on those sorts of topics. Skeptical about raw aggregation, just need to be a little careful on that, and then a little bit presentist bias when thinking about sentient beings that exist today, or definitely will exist in a future scenario.
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of the whether or not to weigh future beings. It makes me think of Tyler Cowen talking to Peter Singer about sort of like geographical versus temporal considerations. But to make a less ridiculous sort of version of the thought,
I think that's one difference, right? Because with a geographical distance, that sentient being still exists. With a temporal distance, that sentient being may never exist at all. So that's one difference. I think if the being does come into existence, then you could argue it's just the same as a geographical distance. But if it's never going to exist at all, then that's very different from the geographic existence. I guess one of the other things about you can then think about from a practical point of view, if you're in a position where you're unable to influence the experience of a being, even though you might grant it moral consideration, you might practically not prioritize it because you can't have an effect. So that, again, that might have a differential impact based on geographical versus temporal distance as well. But
I suppose.
Sorry, you were saying, yeah.
No, it's cool. Tyler Cowen, this situation also, I think, uses this as a basis for why economic growth is a moral imperative. So it's kind of interesting that he's a lot smarter than I am. So who am I to talk? But it's really interesting thinking, and I mean the other thought I have when thinking about the future is, I think, again, maybe this is just a self-serving intuition, and I've built some logic around it, but I think the best chance of us having a wonderful long-term future for all sentient beings is in part to look after the sentient beings that exist at the moment, and particularly, I'm not expecting
non-human species to make an enormous contribution given their capabilities. But certainly with the 8 billion humans we have today, if we could free many more of those 8 billion humans from battling with the bottom half of Maslow's hierarchy, and to free that intellect and that emotion and that power and that compassion, I think that's our best bet of securing an enormous long-term future, not necessarily just sort of waiting for a hinge moment. I think any moment is a potential hinge moment. And that does, in a way, bring you back to some more mainstream concerns about global health and global poverty, and prioritizing the sentient experience of things that exist today, because I think we're largely where the potential lies for securing a good long-term future too.
So with the scope neglect sort of thought experiment that I gave you, a lot more reasonable version of this is like to consider invertebrate suffering or like wild animal suffering. Somebody I think said, like, if you put it conservatively and say 1 in 10 wild animals suffers to the extent that a factory farmed animal does, there's still like an order of like 100 to 1,000 times more or something like that. But in your mind, is just like the sort of awfulness of like factory farming is obviously horrible, and that seems like an easier thing to deal with than wild animal suffering, other than like sort of like population reduction things, which also seem crazy to most vegans. Like, what do you think about invertebrate suffering and that sort of whole scene?
So I and again, I think I'd criticize some people in the wider animal advocacy movement here as well, because I do think, while sentientism is, broad and generic and doesn't specify particular policies, the stance of, what matters morally is it a sentient being? Not is it a wild animal, or is it a farmed animal, or is it a human? Is it sentient? And it also is committed to using evidence and reason and following the science. So as you say, if where that leads you to is a conclusion that there is massive catastrophic suffering in the wild, whether invertebrate or mammal or whatever types, that is a serious ethical negative, and a deep and difficult problem. So I do see wild animal suffering as a deeply high priority problem. So on the scope neglect, on the scope criteria, I think it absolutely qualifies as high priority. Now, of course, the difficulty is, how, and many people in the animal advocacy movement would reject that argument, either because they completely want to focus on animal farming because it's a deliberate harm caused by humans, and it is, and I agree, or because they have some sort of reverence for nature that implies, an antelope being eaten by a lion, that's fine ethically because it's natural. And I fundamentally disagree. I'm not saying the answer is easy. I'm not suggesting, it's viable that we go out and feed Beyond Burgers to all the lions, or, forcibly impose contraception on all predators. But that doesn't mean that the suffering isn't morally salient. I think it absolutely is. One easy way is to then to retreat to animal farming and say there's a clear moral wrong that we're actually making happen, and you can understand in practical terms how to address that. So let's focus there first. But I think there's a strong argument to say we should also balance that by really deepening our research and understanding of wild animal suffering, and work out the really complex issues about how and whether and when we should intervene in some way. Many people will look at that suggestion as patently ridiculous and bizarre, but I think it's an obvious implication of giving moral consideration to all sentient life. We don't have the answers. The field is very immature. It's massively complex problems. There's so much risk of human hubris of intervening in complex multidimensional ecosystems that we don't understand and actually making the problem worse. So those are all valid concerns, but none of them obviate the moral wrong of the outcome of all suffering. So.
Well, I'm going to keep on sort of poking you with specifics that I feel like you might try to duck out of with sentientism in its generality, but there's another sort of thought experiment of like, if you're a high-powered lawyer is it better to, go spend an hour in a soup kitchen, or to, pay somebody to spend 10 hours in a soup kitchen or whatever? And so I think that this can sort of like get a little bit weird sometimes, because like, I know that like Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist guy, he is not a vegan at all. He eats meat, but he donates a huge chunk of money to animal ethics organizations, or that type of thing. And then, Brian Tomasik is more bothered by running in the forest and not stepping on bugs than he is by consuming whey. And these things seem kind of foreign to me and confusing. And I'm wondering if you have the same sort of intuition, or what your thoughts are on those types of things.
I do have the same intuition, because while technically, if you get out a spreadsheet and put in a bunch of different options, you might be able to rationalize some of those approaches. You can always improve it by not doing the thing you're offsetting. Mm-hmm. And there's no need to do the thing you're offsetting in the first place. So yeah, I find that sort of logic a little strange. I mean, I don't doubt that technically, that they might be doing more to alleviate suffering than some other approaches. But yeah, intuitively, it strikes me as odd.
And I suppose those were two sort of unrelated examples, but with the thing about, not running in the forest and, instead eating whey, seems a little odd to me, but I don't know, there's some stuff that Brian Tomasik will talk about where it's like, suffering per gram or per unit time. I'm wondering if this is sort of a disservice, just because, like he had that article about like, should you be concerned about video game characters? And I thought it was a beautiful essay that was really thought out. You're familiar with Brian, I'm assuming, right? Does that do us a disservice though, because it kind of allows there to be this absurdist optics on it, where somebody can write an article like, this guy thinks about video game characters as having moral weight?
I think there is a danger, and in a way that's, many people object to sentientism for obvious reasons, that it's pushing the moral circle further than they wanted to go, right? Because they want to continue eating sentient beings, so they'll stick with a humanist stance, or some more selective approach. So some people want to have a narrower circle than sentience. Other people want to go too far the other way, and they either do that by saying we should grant direct and intrinsic moral consideration to entities that aren't sentient at all, right? Rivers, mountains, plants. And while I think those things are deeply important instrumentally, they're only important to the extent that they have effect on sentient beings. They can't suffer themselves, so they don't need direct intrinsic moral consideration. But the second approach that some people take is that they actually almost redefine sentience or consciousness into something that I think is broader than is supported by the science. And in general, I see sentience as a class of rich, advanced information processing that likely evolved because it was evolutionarily useful to have a rich model of the entity as a self operating in an environment. And that's probably where consciousness and sentience came from. And it requires quite an advanced information processing capability, like a brain or complex nervous system, and also requires that drive or motivation for why it would come into existence in the first place. So I do see sentience as a class of information processing, but not all information processing is sentient. And some people seem to have gone down that path where they will look at plants, or they will look at video game characters, or for a panpsychist, they will take that potentially all the way to saying even elementary particles like electrons and photons are in some sense conscious. And I don't see that supported by the science, both in terms of the information processing capability of those entities. I don't see it supported by a rationale for how consciousness would have emerged in those types of entities, because they're not subject to the sorts of pressures that would lead a biological mobile mammal to be sentient, for example. So I think in both of those instances, I don't subscribe to those views. And I think you're right. It can either make the expansion of a moral circle look a little bit ridiculous because it's gone too far, or it can drift away from established science by redefining a term in the panpsychist sense to say, well, the foundation of all physics and the foundation of the universe is consciousness, and even a photon is conscious, even though time doesn't pass for photons. And if you redefined a term like that is really deeply morally salient, like sentience or consciousness, you've redefined it to such an extent that you're genuinely claiming a photon is able to suffer pain, you've rendered the word entirely meaningless. So yeah, I'm not sympathetic to those types of approaches, and that's why it tends to lead me back to what I think the strong scientific consensus is, which is we're confident of our own sentience and our own consciousness because we're experiencing it right now. I'm confident of your sentience because you're also a human, so we have a pretty common evolutionary basis. So I assume you've got similar sort of information processing kit up here. You're behaving in a way that feels to me like you're sentient. So I'm maybe 99.9% confident I'm sentient, and slightly less that you are, but I'm still confident you are. So, but from that, you can then look at behavior, and you can look at neurology, and you can look at information processing architecture, and evolutionary history. You can put me in an fMRI scanner, and you can start to understand what the physical basis of consciousness is, and then you can look for those analogs elsewhere. And as with any good naturalistic approach, it's provisional and it's probabilistic, right? We don't 100% know. We don't 100% know anything outside of formal systems, but you can form a good level of confidence about, as I said, mammals, reptiles, birds, fish, some of the invertebrates at least, that have something that, means it's highly likely they're, able to experience things. And that's the moral grounding. So that leads me back to that, almost where we started, as where that moral circle needs to be drawn. But again, different sentientists will disagree, right? So there are panpsychist sentientists, and I would challenge them on the scientific basis for that view. Interestingly, when you do talk to them and say, well, does that mean it's wrong to harm a photon, even though it's technically impossible to really do anything to a photon, they will acknowledge that the type of consciousness or sentience that a really, really simple particle has does not warrant the same level of moral consideration. So they'll almost back away from, the crazy moral implications of thinking electrons are conscious by grading sentience to a degree that, in practical terms, we don't need to grant them meaningful moral consideration because their sentience is so breathtakingly simple. It doesn't warrant the same level of consideration as a more complex being. So, but yeah, I'm not particularly sympathetic to those views.
This makes me think of like Matt Dillahunty sort of overtly saying that his reason for eating meat is like, decidedly speciesist, but he has like the cognitive complexity argument where he's like essentially like an animal is, less cognitively complex than I am. And yeah. I think that seems like a place where you still have to draw a line. And most people, I think, I think there's a certain type of person that would draw it at like fish, but I mean, obviously, like we would, not say that. But I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting thing to spend your time grading sentience like that.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, I do think it's useful. I mean, again, this is another thing sentientists would disagree on. Is some do say, look, if something's sentient, it warrants the same moral consideration as any other. So some sentientists work that way. Even though when you put them through a thought experiment of would you save a spider or a chicken or a human from a burning building, we know which way they'll go, right? So even people who are completely egalitarian sentientists normally under pressure will still favor something that's more rich or complex. I mean, personally, I do think it makes sense to grade sentience to a degree that might warrant different moral consideration for different species. But the important thing is that we still set a baseline that any being that is sentient still warrants compassion, still warrants moral consideration, and that means that needlessly harming or killing it would be morally wrong. And that's where I find it deeply frustrating when careful, ethical, moral thinkers, particularly from a humanist or an atheist tradition, form conclusions that to me really just seem self-serving. So and it's almost as though animal ethics is like kryptonite to these otherwise very careful, and logical, ethical thinkers. So, they're committed to evidence and reason, and they're committed to some degree of universal compassion, but then will make excuses for carving out certain species or even all non-human species to allow them to continue doing, what they've always done. To my mind, they seem as trapped by, tradition as the religious people they criticize. And as they've turned away from tradition and followed evidence and reason towards their atheism and their humanism, it seems deeply frustrating to me that they're not able to follow evidence and reason and compassion to recognize that whatever the cognitive capabilities of non-human animals, they suffer, right? And anyone who has a companion animal or a pet or has ever spent any time with any farmed animals knows that. I mean, Sean Carroll is another, and they will recognize that non-human animals are capable of suffering, but then say it doesn't matter because they don't have, a sense of a future life or higher cognitive capabilities or, so I find that deeply frustrating. I find it frustrating for, anybody on the street I meet that hasn't thought these things through, even though I didn't for a long while. But for someone who is, a careful, ethical, rational, naturalistic thinker, to then have this sort of kryptonite when it comes to animal ethics, I find deeply frustrating.
In terms of like the graded sentience, do you think that something like Tononi's sense of phi is like a reasonable approach to that? Or I mean, I think that like Scott Aronson has sort of shut down IIT, but I don't know if you have any feelings on that type of thing.
Yeah, I need to read the papers and go deeper into it. My sense is, I think they're onto something, and there is some sort of correlation between, a richness of integration of information processing and sentience and consciousness. But I'm not sure the relationship works both ways. So one of the people who's joined our sentientism Facebook group is a fascinating philosopher called Eric Fitzgable, and he's written some beautiful papers. One about what is it like, if anything, to be a garden snail, which is sort of echoes the famous Nagel paper about what is it like to be a bat. But he's also written another paper about, is the United States conscious? And the argument is, and he doesn't have a strong view either way, but he's at least framing the view to say that if consciousness and sentience really are just a class of information processing, why do they have to be part of an integrated biological unit? Couldn't you have some sort of wider system of interacting parts that share, processes information that could be conscious? I love the idea. I think, but just having rich, complex information processing isn't enough to qualify for sentience or consciousness. I think it's a particular type of information processing that's likely to only have come about either because, it evolved because it was somewhat functionally useful to have this, as I said before, a sort of model of the self in the environment, and that subjective awareness sort of came as part of the package. Or maybe in the future, because we've explicitly designed it in, once we understand enough about consciousness and sentience to make it happen. I don't think it's likely to come about just because there's a rich integration of information processing. It needs some other driver, functional driver, to lead to sentience and consciousness, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think they're onto something there, but I'm not sure it needs more than just the level of integration.
Yeah, I was very impressed when I first came across Tononi and Christoph Koch's work on that, but there's a lot to dive into there, and I'm curious with consciousness type stuff. Is there any sort of model of consciousness that you put particularly high credence on?
Not particularly. I mean, beyond what I've laid out, in that I do think it is just a class of information processing. So the school of thought it probably closest aligns to is the sort of illusionist view. But I don't really like the term illusionism because it implies that illusionists are saying consciousness is an illusion, but we know it's not because we're experiencing it. And I think what illusionism is really saying is, it's not saying consciousness isn't real or consciousness is illusory. It's saying there is matter, energy, and information processing and nothing else. So if you think there's something else apart from that is consciousness, that's the illusion. But what I'm saying is consciousness and sentience are very real, and they are classes of information processing, which are represented in, energy and matter interacting in very complex, rich ways. So it's a very sort of materialist, naturalistic information processing view of consciousness and sentience.
And that's essentially that's like being an eliminativist, or like a sort of Dennett it from bit type thing. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, it's similar to Dennett's stance, although I differ with him on on the free will and the compatibilism side of it. But yeah, it's just a rich, complex class of information processing. Gotcha.
Okay. Well, as we wind up here, I've sort of been wrestling with this question myself, because a little bit about me. I'm a composer, guitarist, like improviser type. That I do artistic work, but I'm very interested in these sort of altruistic fields, and seeing like the effective altruism movement, and how it's essentially like people who are able to just throw a lot of money at these problems to make a big concrete dent. Yeah. And like negative utilitarianism is something I generally resonate with. But in that view, I think that bringing beauty and vibrance into the world has sort of lower moral urgency than reducing suffering or something like that. And as somebody who's like sort of dedicated his life to aesthetic things, I'm just wondering what you think the role of like the artist is in this, other than sort of being somebody that's like, I'm going to put song lyrics that talk about sentientism or something like that. Like, how does an artist most usefully contribute to the sentientist movement?
Well, one is I think art and music and culture are deeply important. I mean, they're ways of directly impacting the quality of sentient experience from moment to moment, that bring enormous richness and value to people. So I wouldn't underplay that. I'd agree. I think there is an asymmetry between the importance of reducing suffering versus enhancing flourishing, if you like. But that doesn't mean enhancing flourishing isn't deeply important and valuable. It's also the naturalistic side of sentientism. Some people think that's quite cold and hard and emotionless and scientistic, and it's just about facts and reason and putting everything in a spreadsheet. And that's not the case, right? There's enormous awe and wonder and mystery in provisionally trying to understand the world, and a sense of connectedness that is very physically real. So I don't think it needs to come across as a sort of cold scientistic approach either. But to answer your question about how art and music and culture can help, I'm a big fan of the effective altruism movement, because in a way it's sort of trying to put into practice what sentientism is talking about. It's saying we need a wide moral circle that includes all sentient beings, and we should use evidence and reason to think about how to, make the world a better place for all of those sentient beings as much as we can. I mean, there are religious effective altruists and supernatural effective altruists as well, but most people in the effective altruism movement, do take animal ethics seriously and have a naturalistic stance as well. So I think many of them are sentientist. But the cause prioritization within effective altruism, scope, tractability, and so on, and neglect, I think it's really important. But there's also an enormous amount of uncertainty about, what are the best things to do, and that's part of my motivation behind trying to develop and popularize sentientism. Because even if you're in a situation where, you have enormous moral uncertainty, and I think Will McCaskill's written a great piece on that recently. And even if you're really uncertain about what the right things to do are, how to progress, what the right evidence is that supports your argument, which causes to drive, even in a situation where there's enormous uncertainty about those things, there's something reassuring about improving, I guess, human values, because while it's less direct as an impact, you can, I think, be pretty confident that the results will be positive rather than negative. Because if we have a moral circle that includes all suffering beings and we use evidence and reason, we're going to be in a better position to take every single decision, whether that's a personal, individual decision, an institutional decision, a policy decision. So one, I think it's a safer upgrading those values is quite a safe thing to try and do if you're uncertain. But it also can have very, very pervasive positive effects, because if someone's values really do shift towards that naturalistic, sentiocentric, sentientist stance, arguably that improves every decision they take from now on at every level. So, and I think, art, music, and culture can play a really important role in that values shift story, because it can help people emotionally connect with the importance of assessing our own values, improving them, and developing them. So I think there's maybe a more obvious role for art and music and science, art and music and culture, in helping shift human values than there is in some of the more specific campaigns.
Now, what about like more like abstract sort of artistic stuff, where like there isn't, like you aren't really handing off the idea of sentientism. It's just like, I'm making bleeps and blops and with pitches and frequencies and stuff. I mean, other than just sort of adding some sort of intellectual stimulation or like aesthetic stimulation, I mean, I don't know. I'm asking, but
no, but I mean, personally, I get enormous pleasure from bleeps and blobs and nice fat bass lines. So that's important. It's a valuable contribution, right, in its own right. But also, and this is a common challenge with the ineffective altruism movement, is you've got to look after yourself, right? And if you don't look after yourself and what's important to you and what you enjoy, one, your quality of your own life will degrade, but also you're probably less well positioned to help others. So there is this challenge around this sort of demanding this view of ethics that, is there a way of recognizing the catastrophic suffering in the universe and a moral imperative to do something about that without letting that crush you to a point where you give up and crawl into a shell. So I think, your bleeps and bloops give direct pleasure to anyone who hears them, and also it's a part of you have a responsibility to look after the quality of your own sentient experience as well. So as you enjoy creating that stuff, you should revel in it. So
fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it's a marathon, not a race, as they say.
Yeah.
A sort of a fun question that I guess end on is, if you were to like sort of have a set of music people or artists or whatever to do like a sentient fest, who would you choose? Who would be good spokespeople?
That's tough. Oh man, there are already some, right? So one of the things on the website, there's the website you've seen, sentientism.info, where you've kindly added yourself to the wall as well, which is wonderful, because it's sort of helping to normalize the idea and have people sign up. But there's another page there of suspected sentientists, and these are people who are like celebrities or well-known people who I think this way already, right? So they're already humanistic or atheistic or at least agnostic in their naturalism, in their worldview. They don't have supernatural views and they're not religious, but they're also clearly very serious about their animal ethics, normally because they're vegan. Now, so far, the musicians on there are not necessarily to my personal taste, but so Bryan Adams is on the list as an example. So I think we'd have to have him there because he's already, I think, in line with sentientism. But one of the things I'd love to do would be to take some of the artists who have quite a strong religious ethos and convert them to being, naturalistic atheists who, are then serious about their animal ethics as well. So maybe there's some we want to convert.
I'm up for it. Cool. So beyond Bryan Adams, like, can you think of anybody else that's aligned within the movement?
Well, in terms of I'm not sure in the music world. The music world seems interesting because there's quite a lot of religiosity in behind some of the people I like. So in the modern classical world, like Arvo Pärt, for example, I think writes beautiful music, but has a deep religious ethos behind everything he does. I love a lot of hip hop music as well, but there's quite a strong religiosity amongst some of those artists I really respect. It's more patchy, interestingly. I think, if anything, the animal ethics thing and veganism seems to get more traction with, many of the, really well-known artists. But there's more of a hesitancy about the naturalist side of that. And maybe there's something in the artistic temperament that's sort of drawn to the mystical and the spiritual and the supernatural in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, in like just looking around various like rationalist websites and like blogs and stuff, if you search for art, you might find something about like some sort of anime, but if you search for music, you won't find anything. Like there's nothing about music on Less Wrong, for instance.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
do you know,
interesting.
another one art, have you heard of Barker?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he's, you're probably aware, right? But he's influenced directly by David Pearce's work, and
Mm-hmm.
I think both of them are sentientists as well. So we should probably put him and you headlining.
True, that sounds great.
And Brian Adams can be your support act.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds. That will be the day.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Me and Barker headlining over Brian Adams.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool.
I'd buy a ticket.
Do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter at Jamie Woodhouse, but also at Sentientism. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it is what it is. The main website is at sentientism.info, and there you'll find John on the wall, and our suspected celebrity sentientists, and a bunch of different podcasts and videos and articles I've written. But probably most importantly is we're trying to build some online global communities around the idea as well. They're all open to anyone. They're open to anyone who's interested in the idea. You don't have to be a sentientist. So we have religious people in there. We have people of all different types of views. But if you search for sentientism on any of the usual forums, the big main one is on Facebook, where we have people from I think over 90 countries now. It's a fascinating mix of activists and academics and policy people and writers, but mostly just interested lay people like me from absolutely every continent and over 90 countries. But we've got a Discord server and a Telegram and a LinkedIn group and a bunch of others as well. People are very welcome to come and visit. But yeah, probably the core is sentientism.info, at Sentientism on Twitter, and then look for that Sentientism group on Facebook, and you're all welcome. And I'd love to hear feedback about the ideas, because while they're, the basics are very simple, right? Evidence, reason, and compassion. There's some potentially quite challenging, contentious implications. And when you look through what it means for, religious or supernatural worldviews, and the practices that flow from that, and some of the warped ethics that flow from those worldviews, as well as the animal ethics stuff that we've talked about today, there's some pretty serious implications of that worldview that, I'd love to get people's feedback on and continue the conversation.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll also link that below and all that. But yeah, thanks so much for talking to me, Jamie. This was fun.
That's great. A real pleasure. Really good to meet you on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, we'll be in contact, I'm sure.
Thanks, John. Take care, mate.
You too. Bye.